Hey guys, welcome to the Stand Up Review podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're reviewing George Lopez's 2020 special, We'll Do It for Half. Let's get into it. This podcast is brought to you by our patrons. If you want to help support the podcast, then head on over to patreon.com/standupreview. With tiers starting at as little as £1, there are some great benefits, such as voting for which specials you want reviewed, Q&As, bloopers, early access to podcasts, exclusive podcasts, and many more. Sign up at patreon.com/standupreview, and thank you for your support. As a special limited time offer, anyone who becomes a patron during the month of July, regardless of which tier, can choose one stand-up special that will be reviewed on the podcast, as well as receiving the standard benefits for the tier you choose. This offer runs out on the 31st of July, so head on over to patreon.com/standupreview for this one-time deal. So we'll start off with a little bit of background on George. George Lopez is a big name in American television, probably best known for his TV shows titled George Lopez and another called Just Lopez. He has also had a show called Lopez Tonight. This special came out the day before this podcast is being released, so obviously it's his latest special, but he has done several stand-up shows in the past. When I saw this special was being released, it was the first I had ever heard of Lopez. I've never seen any of his stuff before, but I always like finding new people. In terms of his style, it's a lot of observational comedy with a little bit of storytelling, but it's also very fast-paced. There's no room to stop and digest anything. He's straight on to the next bit. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into the show itself. The show opens to George getting a huge standing ovation. He gives a little bit of an introduction, but he makes it funny and includes a couple of jokes in there. And it's a really good example of how to do an introduction if you are going to do one. In the first bit, he talks about deportation. He starts off with quite a serious message, which is understandable, especially given the subject matter. But he gets funny very quickly, and even though he's talking about a lot of quite heavy political stuff, he does a great job of having jokes spread throughout it, so it never feels very heavy. He then talks about his uncle, and there's just a few quick-fire jokes here about his uncle. They're all pretty good though. But he goes on to talk about Latino culture more generally, and he's got some decent jokes. There are a lot of cultural references in there, so there might be parts I don't get, and they're funnier than I can tell. But it might be better if you are Latino or you know a lot about Latino cultures. He goes on to talk about animals, and he doesn't really stick on one topic for very long. He just gets a few good jokes and then moves on. Which I've said before, it's better to move on before a bit stops being funny rather than stick with it for no reason. But sometimes there's not enough there and the bit just moves on before you've really had a chance to get into it. And it's important to actually hook an audience into a bit before you move on, or if you're going to talk about it at all. Afterwards, he talks about aging, and he does a good job including jokes when he's giving background to a bit, so that part that usually goes a little bit of time without a laugh, he can get a few laughs in. But generally throughout the whole show, there is a bit too much setup or talking without jokes. But at times, and especially in this bit, he does a good job of trying to keep it funny. He then jumps to talking about Halloween, and this is a really good bit. It's just a few quick-fire jokes, but it seems to be where he's at his best in terms of just dropping in a few good jokes and moving on. I think the only real problem with him doing that is that he seems to try and set it up as an entire bit, where really it's just a minute or two talking about a topic, but this bit is really good. He goes on to talk about parents, and he's got a couple of really good, really funny stories here. A little bit of a deviation away from his usual style, but it works really well. He links this into talking about widows, and again, it's another pretty good bit, but his jokes are very hit and miss. And when the bits are as short as they are, there's not really a lot of room for bad jokes or for even average jokes, really. He again does a pretty good job of linking this into talking about having children. And this is a really good bit. It's probably one of the better bits of the show. There are some really funny jokes in there, and he does a generally good job of not making this seem like it's a tiny bit. Probably because it's linked to the previous two in a way, so it feels a bit longer. And the way he transitions them together works really well. After this, well, they're a little bit linked. He talks about Latino women, and this bit starts off really well, but it kind of dies out. At times it seems like some of the bits aren't finished yet, and even some of the good bits have got very abrupt endings, and it seems like there should have been more, which it's generally good to leave your audience wanting a bit more, but when it feels like there is actually more to get out of it, it's a fine balance, and it's quite hard to do, but some of the parts just outright feel like they need more work put into them. In the next bit, he talks about people injuring themselves, and this bit is a good example of how this show just isn't my sense of humour. And I can tell how it's funny and why people would like the show. And I do find certain parts, even within this bit, really funny. But overall, this bit really isn't for me. And that's just personal preference, of course. Afterwards, he jumps around a few different topics, and they're all fine, but by this point of the show, he's pretty much using the same style of jokes as he's used throughout the rest of the show, and a lot of it is either predictable or very obvious jokes. And there are still some funny parts, obviously, but it's I found it at least, very easy to lose interest, and maybe I'm being a bit harsh, and again, there might be certain cultural references that I don't get that would make it funny, but at this point, I just started to feel like he'd front-loaded the show with all of his best material, and this was just to make it up to an hour, and it's not even an hour, it's 50 minutes. But he then talks about gender reveal parties, and this is quite funny, and it doesn't go on long enough. And again, it's that thing of feeling like there's something else to get out of it, and it can just be quite frustrating when you're watching, because when there is something good, you're really wanting to go into it and have a good 5 to 10 minutes on it, but it seems to just stop after a minute or two. He then jumps to talking about taking pictures of food, and I just didn't find this bit funny. It's kind of as simple as that. And to George's credit, it did feel like a complete bit. It was still quite short, but it had an ending, and there's always a chance that because I didn't find it funny, I was just ready for it to end. But generally speaking, the bits in this show haven't been structured well, but this one felt like one of the few where he got everything he could out of it, no more, no less. And sometimes there's just not a lot to say about something, but I like the structure of this bit, just not the content. In the next bit, he spoke about bedtime stories, and one thing he does really well throughout the whole show, but in this bit particular, he's very good at giving a little bit of a serious message, but then transitioning that into some jokes. And I've reviewed comics who don't seem to know how to include serious messages into comedy shows, but he does it really well and will make fun of the serious message in a way where it's still obvious that he means the seriousness of the message, but it's also still a comedy show and you're still here to laugh. And from what I can gather from a little bit of research, he's quite an important kind of public member of the Latino community, so he's clearly been getting messages across and trying to make political statements throughout his whole career, and he's learned how to do that in a comedic way very, very well. He then talks about the state of America more generally, I guess. And this is another really good bit. It includes some serious messages, but he keeps it lighthearted, as I mentioned in the previous bit. But the jokes here are really good, and it's a much better structured part of the show. It seems like a lot of his better material is towards the front and the back end of the show, and the middle bit is kind of filler. He goes on to talk about school, and it's another really good bit. It's very well written, and he performs it in a way where you're not sure what's coming next, which when certain parts of the show seem very predictable, it's quite a nice change. And this leads us into the ending where he ends on some more very serious stuff, and he doesn't include any jokes in sort of the little ending portion. And I get why he's ended the show in the way he does, but one or two jokes mixed in and a joke maybe to end on, I think would have rounded out the show in a much better way. But I also understand wanting to end on a serious message. And it's not a massively long ending part of the show, so it's not too bad. Now, a few extra things. As far as callbacks go, there are a few little ones throughout the show. They mostly work fine and they're just little jokes that aren't supposed to get huge laughs. But there is one point where a callback seems like he's expecting a bigger laugh and he just doesn't get it at all. And it's just not as funny as he seems to expect it to be. It's a little bit awkward at the time, but as I said, generally the callbacks are all just nice little bits. For transitions, I've already mentioned it a few times, but the general structure of this show feels a bit off. A lot of times he just moves on before a bit feels like it's over. And it's way too fast-paced, at least for my liking. There are a few transitions between bits that are seamless, but for the most part, he just kind of cuts from one thing to the next. And like I've said before, that's fine, but the general structure of the show is a bigger problem than the actual transitions. As for the audience, they are very much there for George. He's clearly built an audience within the Latino community especially, and they like his comedy. That means there are some laughs that feel out of place for me, but I can get to why that might be in a minute. There are some huge laughs that I think are out of place or that come when not even he's expecting them. But for the most part, I think the crowd do a good job of adding something to the special, and there are certain parts where they join in with the special to really good effect. Okay, so some overall thoughts. This show isn't for me. It's clearly not my sense of humour, and it feels like it's aimed at Latinos, although not solely at them. And that's fine. Not every comedy show has to be for everyone. George has clearly built an audience that loves what he does, and good for him. He is funny. If you're Latino or you're not a fan of longer storytelling type comedy, give it a watch, see what you think. But for me, I really didn't enjoy the show at all. Parts were good for sure, but I won't be watching any more George Lopez unless you guys want me to, or until he releases a new special, and for that reason, I'm going with a 3 out of 10. Thanks for listening to the Stand Up Review podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to get new episodes as soon as they come out every Monday, Wednesday and Friday. Check out our Patreon for some awesome benefits at patreon.com/standupreview. If you have any thoughts or suggestions for the show, whether it be a new segment or a show you'd like us to review, let us know on Facebook, Instagram or Twitter at standupreview, and give us a follow while you're over there. Feel free to share this or any of our other podcasts on any social media platform. Have a great day, and we'll see you for the next episode.